It was supposed to be just another shopping trip before the new year. But what happened next would leave everyone in the store stunned and change the way they saw everything. No, 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 not Jersey City. Eastbound over, no longer named All in the Family. It's I'm your housemate, Daniel. The grocery store buzzed with energy. It was New Year's Eve, and the aisles were alive with the rhythm of last-minute shoppers. Cheerful music played softly in the background, mixing with the chatter of families and the occasional squeak of shopping carts. Laughter echoed near the bakery section as children pointed at colorful cakes, while a cashier greeted each customer with a warm, Happy New Year. On her way out in the produce aisle, Marcus browsed thoughtfully. He was in his early 30s, tall and athletic, wearing a blue hoodie and jeans. His calm demeanor made him blend effortlessly into the crowd, though his warm smile left a lasting impression on anyone who crossed his path. Marcus picked up a bag of collard greens, inspecting them with care. These were for his mother's New Year dinner, a family tradition she refused to skip, no matter how busy life got. Marcus had grown up in this town. He knew its quirks and routines like the back of his hand. Now, as a youth mentor, he spent his days helping kids navigate challenges, big and small. It was something he loved, a way to give back to the place that had shaped him. So, how do you want to go about this? Just a few feet away, an elderly woman stood by the apples. Eleanor, in her late 70s, adjusted her glasses with a sharp tug. Her silver hair was pinned neatly in place, but her expression carried a trace of impatience. She muttered to herself about the long lines in the crowd, her words barely audible over the hum of the store. While I got to learn skating, I got even more serious, I said. My parents... She frowned as a child nearby accidentally bumped into her cart, muttering something under her breath about parents not teaching manners anymore. Eleanor's cardigan sleeves were pushed up slightly, revealing thin wrists, but her stance was firm and unapologetic. She reached for a bag of apples, muttering again when one fell to the floor. "Sham, girl," Thatch growled. "Sham, girl." For Eleanor, this wasn't just another shopping trip. It was a reminder of how much things had changed, and not always in ways she liked. She sighed heavily, her gaze sweeping the store. Families from different backgrounds filled the aisles. To most, it was a beautiful snapshot of community. But to Eleanor, it felt unfamiliar. Sighing tearfully, Marcus moved closer, scanning the nearby shelves for oranges. He hadn't noticed Eleanor yet, too focused on ticking items off his list. The hum of the store wrapped around him, a mix of warmth and holiday cheer. But not for everyone. Eleanor adjusted her cart, glancing toward Marcus with a sharp, lingering look. She muttered under her breath again, words laced with something harder to ignore this time. The stage was set. It was supposed to be just another shopping trip before the new year, but some moments, no matter how ordinary they seem, have a way of becoming unforgettable. Marcus turned into the produce section, his basket swinging lightly by his side. The smell of fresh fruits and vegetables filled the air, mixing with the faint notes of cheerful New Year's music playing overhead. He scanned the shelves, looking for oranges. Then something caught his eye. An acquaintance shelf and a new book was lying toward one. His eyes landed on a neat pyramid of them stacked in the corner. He moved toward them, weaving past a woman standing near the apples. As he reached for a bag of oranges, his elbow brushed against a shopping cart parked just a little too close to the display. It shifted slightly, the wheels creaking. "Excuse me," Marcus said politely, glancing toward the cart's owner. The woman turned sharply. She was elderly, probably in her late 70s, with neatly pinned silver hair and a beige cardigan. Her pale blue eyes locked onto Marcus, narrowing. Upon seeing Oliver staring, she laughed. Her lips tightened as she gripped the handle of her cart. "You people don't belong here," she said, her voice sharp. Eric. Marcus froze. For a moment, he thought he'd misheard her. The words didn't register right away, their weight sinking in slowly. "I'm sorry?" he asked, turning to face her fully. His tone was calm, but there was a flicker of disbelief in his voice. The woman squared her shoulders, her grip on the cart tightening. Her face, lined with age, was set in a look of firm disapproval. "Why don't you go back to where you came from?" she snapped, this time louder. She's also probably not smiling because her hands are, well, her words cut through the cheerful buzz of the store like a knife. The air in the aisle grew heavier, as if someone had turned the volume down on the world. Shoppers nearby slowed their movements, their gazes flickering toward the scene. A mother with a toddler hurriedly steered her cart away, whispering something to her child. An older man in a baseball cap lingered by the potatoes, glancing nervously between Marcus and the woman. Marcus stood still, gripping the handle of his basket tightly. His mind raced, each second stretching longer than the last. Did she really just say that? The first spark of anger flared in his chest, hot and insistent. It rose quickly, his pulse quickening with it. He wanted to speak, to push back, to tell her exactly how wrong she was. But he didn't. He thought of his parents. His father, who had always told him to keep his head high in the face of ignorance. His mother, who taught him the strength in choosing dignity over anger. He could hear their voices in his mind, steadying him. Marcus inhaled deeply. He let the breath fill his lungs before exhaling slowly, grounding himself. Across from him, the woman, Eleanor, her name tag read, remained rigid. Her pale fingers gripped the handle of her cart as if it anchored her. Her chin lifted slightly, her posture defiant. She wasn't backing down. He cut himself. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he stayed calm. He could feel the eyes of the onlookers on him. Some stared openly, their expressions ranging from discomfort to curiosity. Others tried to pretend they weren't paying attention, but failed. The soft murmur of the store had faded, replaced by an awkward, thick silence. Even the gentle hum of the refrigerators seemed muted. When he spoke again, his voice remained distant. Time seemed to slow. Marcus blinked, his thoughts whirling. What do I say? He ran through the possibilities in his mind. He could yell, let his anger loose, he could walk away, pretend it hadn't happened, but neither felt right. This moment demanded more. Marcus adjusted his grip on his basket and straightened his shoulders. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. Wait, wait, wait. Eleanor watched him closely, her expression firm but her hand trembling slightly on the cart's handle. Her words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. Then her fingers curled into the cart's handles, and her hand slipped to the front of his pants. Marcus's mind settled on one thought. This wasn't just about him. The tension in the aisle was almost unbearable. A young employee stacking bananas nearby froze, his hand hovering over a box of produce. A cashier craned her neck to get a better view of what was happening, her eyes wide with concern. One glance, and she was gone. Marcus took another deep breath. He let the air flow through him, calming the fire that burned just beneath the surface. He looked Eleanor in the eye. His expression wasn't angry. It was thoughtful, deliberate. The crowd watched silently, their curiosity and discomfort holding them in place. Some waited for Marcus to lash out, while others hoped the moment would simply pass. But no one left. They were witnesses now. Marcus stayed quiet for a moment longer, letting the tension in the air stretch. He knew the power of words, and he wanted to choose his carefully. Eleanor's gaze faltered slightly, just for a second, but she quickly recovered. She adjusted her glasses with her free hand, her lips pressed into a thin line. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady but low. "Ma'am, do you realize what you just said?" His words were calm, but carried weight, cutting through the silence like a blade. Marcus stood tall, his basket resting on the floor beside him, his calm gaze fixed on Eleanor, but his voice carried strength. Eleanor was certain that his advance wouldn't lead to the answering of her questions. It didn't matter to both of them. "Ma'am, do you realize what you've just said?" The question lingered in the air, cutting through the thick silence that had settled over the aisle. Eleanor didn't flinch. Her expression remained firm, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I said what I said," she replied, her tone sharp and unapologetic. "People like you don't belong here." "But you—" The words stung. Marcus could feel the weight of them, but he refused to let them push him down. He took a steadying breath, glancing briefly at the onlookers, who stood frozen nearby, looking tired and weary and weak, and browsing the totter. "All right," he said, nodding slightly. "Let's talk about that." His tone wasn't angry, it wasn't accusatory, it was calm, deliberate, and that made it all the more powerful. The crowd seemed to hold its breath as Marcus took a step forward, not closer to Eleanor, but into the space between them, commanding the moment. The sudden shrillness of wound caused everyone's heart to cease for a moment. "You think I don't belong here?" Marcus began. "Let me tell you about where I come from." Eleanor adjusted her glasses, her grip on the cart tightening. She looked like she wanted to interrupt, but something in Marcus's voice held her back. "My great-grandparents were born in the South," Marcus continued, his voice steady. "They were enslaved, owned, beaten, treated like property, but they survived. Somehow, they survived." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. "And after slavery ended, they became sharecroppers," Marcus said, his gaze never wavering. "They worked land they didn't own, breaking their backs so their children might have a better chance at life." Eleanor's defiant expression faltered slightly. She shifted her weight, but Marcus pressed on. "My grandfather fought in World War II," he said, his tone gaining strength. "He risked his life for this country, for the freedoms we all enjoy today. But when he came home, he couldn't sit at the same counters as you. He couldn't drink from the same fountains." Dude, a murmur rippled through the small crowd. The man near the potatoes crossed his arms, nodding slightly. "But he stayed," Marcus said, his voice softening for a moment. "He stayed because he believed in the promise of this country, even when it didn't believe in him." And then he turned and left the captain's quarters, giving Ocean one wing of the hallway as he left. Eleanor's lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Marcus's calm, steady gaze held her in place. "My parents," he continued, his voice carrying both pride and pain, "taught me that kindness and hard work matter. My mother is a teacher. She's spent her life helping kids who don't always have someone to believe in them. My father is a mechanic, the kind of man who'd stop to help you if your car broke down, no matter what you just said to me." The silence in the aisle was deafening. Even the soft hum of the refrigerators seemed muted. "So, ma'am," Marcus said, taking another step forward, "when you tell me I don't belong here, what you're really saying is that their sacrifices don't matter, that their blood, sweat, and tears weren't enough for you." Eleanor's face flushed, her grip on the cart trembling slightly. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Marcus exhaled slowly, letting the tension settle before continuing. "And here's the thing," he said, his voice soft but firm. "This is New Year's Eve, a time for reflection, a time to look at ourselves and ask, who do we want to be? What kind of world do we want to build? And what—" The words seemed to ripple through the crowd. A young woman near the bread aisle nodded silently, her hand resting on her chest. "My family celebrates New Year's by honoring the past," Marcus explained, his tone shifting to something more hopeful. "We remember the struggles that brought us here, but we also look forward. We make a promise to be better, to build a future where hate like this doesn't have a place." He glanced briefly at the onlookers, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "That's the promise I've made every year, and it's the one I'll keep tonight." Eleanor looked away, her expression a mix of discomfort and something deeper. something that looked like doubt. Marcus turned back to her, his tone gentle but unwavering. Ma'am, it's not too late to let go of the hate you're holding on to. This is the perfect time for a fresh start, a new year, a chance to be better. Eleanor's hands trembled on the cart handle. She glanced around, searching for an ally in the crowd, but found none. A middle-aged man in a baseball cap stepped forward, breaking the silence. He's right, the man said, his voice firm. We've got to do better than this. So the ripple effect began. A young cashier called out from her station. What he said, it's true, we've all got to think about the kind of people we want to be. The murmurs grew louder. A woman near the frozen foods aisle nodded. My dad fought in that same war, she said softly, her voice trembling. He always told me the only color that mattered was the red on the flag. And Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, her face pale. She looked at Marcus again, and for the first time, her eyes didn't hold defiance. They held something else. Regret, maybe, or the beginnings of it. Marcus bent down to pick up his basket. He stood tall again, looking directly at her. His voice softened. Words matter. Actions matter even more. It's not about where we come from. It's about where we're going. He didn't wait for her to respond. Instead, he nodded slightly, turning to leave. The crowd parted for him, their eyes following as he walked away. Behind him, the store felt different. Quiet. Reflective. Eleanor stood motionless, her trembling hands gripping the cart. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. Marcus didn't look back. He didn't need to. Some seeds take time to grow. Silence was deafening. For a moment, no one moved. The air in the grocery store was thick, as if the weight of Marcus's words had pushed everything else aside. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed muted. He slowly stood up, hugged everyone once, and then squeezed Marcus as he passed. Then, a middle-aged man wearing a faded baseball cap stepped forward. His eyes locked on Eleanor, then shifted to Marcus. His voice was steady, but carried the weight of emotion. He's right, the man said, breaking the stillness. We need to be better than this. The words hung in the air, simple yet profound. Someone near the bakery nodded. A woman near the dairy section murmured, "Absolutely." Her voice soft but clear. One by one, heads began to turn toward Marcus, faces filled with quiet admiration. The crowd started to stir. The tension that had held them frozen began to ease, replaced by a ripple of murmurs. By the checkout counter, a young cashier no older than 20 spoke up. Her voice carried across the aisles, trembling slightly, but full of sincerity. I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully, she said, her cheeks flushed. Thank you for speaking up. Marcus glanced toward her and offered a faint smile, his calm demeanor unwavering. Near the frozen foods aisle, an older couple whispered to each other. The husband, a stout man with thinning white hair, finally spoke aloud. His voice was gruff but kind. My family went through the same thing, he said. It's hard to forget, but you handled it better than most ever could. His wife, a petite woman with soft brown eyes, placed a hand over her heart. My parents taught me to stand up for what's right, she added, her voice cracking slightly. You reminded me of them just now. Marcus nodded in quiet acknowledgement, his gaze sweeping across the small crowd. Meanwhile, Eleanor stood stiffly by her cart. Her face had gone pale, her lips pressed tightly together. Her hands trembled as she clutched the cart's handle, her knuckles white. The fire in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by something harder to read. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but quickly closed it again. She adjusted her cart again with shaky hands, her gaze darting nervously around the room. The defiance she had shown moments ago seemed to drain away, replaced by discomfort and unease. I didn't mean, she started, her voice faltering. The crowd watched her, waiting, but she stopped mid-sentence, her words catching in her throat. She cleared her throat, her cheeks flushing deeper. Without finishing, she looked down at her cart, suddenly busy rearranging the apples she'd already picked up. On the carpet before her, she sat facing a knight with a band present. The silence stretched for a beat longer, heavy but no longer suffocating. Ugh. Uh, my. Then someone began to clap. It started slow, hesitant, but deliberate. The sound echoed through the aisle, drawing the attention of everyone around. A man near the deli counter joined in, then a woman near the bread aisle. Within moments, the applause swelled, filling the store with its rhythm. It wasn't loud or raucous, but it carried weight. It was a gesture of support, of solidarity. Eleanor froze. Her face burned red as the sound grew around her. She glanced toward Marcus, her eyes wide and unsure, before looking away entirely. Marcus, however, didn't bask in the applause. He simply nodded, his expression calm and steady, as if to say, "This isn't about me. This is about all of us." The clapping slowed, but left behind an unmistakable sense of unity. People began to exchange quiet words with one another. A woman resting her hand on her child's shoulder whispered, "This is what we need to teach them." By now, Eleanor's shoulders had slumped. She reached for her cart and began to push it toward the exit. Her steps were slow, almost reluctant, as if weighed down by the moment she was walking away from. No, I don't remember. As she turned the corner out of sight, the crowd shifted its attention back to Marcus. A woman near him stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly, "for saying what needed to be said." Like, I'm sorry, Marcus," she said. "I ain't to mouth the gaggle, but I wish we could convince fewer people to, you know." Marcus gave her a small smile, his voice just as gentle. "Sometimes," he replied, "it's not about winning. It's about being heard." The crowd gradually dispersed, the buzz of the store returning to life, but the atmosphere felt different now. Lighter, more thoughtful. For Marcus, it wasn't about the applause or the words of gratitude. It was about the possibility of change, the small, steady ripples that moments like this could create. He was obsessed with seeing change for the better working continually, even in the face of the fight for his rightful place. Eleanor sat at her dining table, staring at the plate of food in front of her. The fork lay untouched beside it. The warm glow of the kitchen lights felt harsh, their brightness doing little to soften the knot forming in her chest. Ursula Campa, Dr. James Campa, a medical doctor who, in his spare time, made dinners as well as any man in favor of hers, drawled after Eleanor as she left for the kitchen lobby. She had spent years cooking meals for her family in this very kitchen. It was a place of comfort, of routine. But tonight, it felt different. The smells of roasted chicken and steamed vegetables barely registered. Her mind was elsewhere. Marcus's words replayed in her head, each one clearer than the last. "My great-grandparents were enslaved. My grandfather fought in the war. My parents raised me to believe in kindness." Eleanor closed her eyes, gripping the edge of the table. Those words had landed heavily in the store, but now, in the quiet of her home, they felt even heavier. She couldn't shake them. They echoed in her mind, unrelenting. She thought about the way Marcus had spoken, not with anger, but with dignity. The steadiness in his voice had disarmed her. He hadn't lashed out. He hadn't humiliated her. Instead, he'd held a mirror up to her, forcing her to look at herself in a way she never had before. And she didn't like what she saw. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she picked up her glass of water. She took a sip, hoping it would steady her. It didn't. She set the glass down with a soft clink, her gaze falling to her plate again. The truth was, she had always thought of herself as a good person. She went to church every Sunday, She donated to the food drive each holiday season. She baked cookies for her grandchildren and knitted blankets for charity. But good people didn't say the things she had said today. Um, Eleanor pushed her plate away, her appetite long gone. The memories came unbidden, slipping into her mind like unwelcome guests. She thought about her father, a tall man with a booming voice. He'd had strong opinions about everyone and everything. He'd often sat at the head of the dining table, grumbling about how things were changing too fast. This country isn't what it used to be, he'd say, his tone sharp. People need to stay where they belong. As a child, Eleanor had listened quietly, absorbing his words without question. She hadn't known any better. She'd grown up in a world where certain ideas were never challenged. Her mother, always busy in the kitchen, rarely spoke up. When Eleanor asked her about the things her father said, her mother would just shrug. "That's the way things are, dear," she'd say. Um, uh? It wasn't just her father's words, though. It was the world around her, her small town, her school, her church. They had all reinforced the same ideas. People stuck to their own. It was just how life was. But now, sitting at her table decades later, Eleanor wondered if any of it had ever been right. Marcus's voice echoed in her mind again. "My grandfather fought in the war. He couldn't sit at the same counters, couldn't drink from the same fountains. Marcus? She thought about her own father's military service. He'd fought in the same war. She had always been so proud of his sacrifice, his courage, but she had never considered what it must have been like for men like Marcus's grandfather. Men who had fought the same battles, but returned to a country that didn't treat them as equals. The thought made her chest tighten. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her hands resting in her lap. For the first time in years, she felt truly unsettled. Had she been wrong all along? She thought about the words she had said to Marcus, "You people don't belong here." They had come out so easily, so reflexively, but now they felt ugly. They felt cruel. She had never thought of herself as cruel before. And now, she had said she would help Peppo. Eleanor's gaze drifted to a photograph on the wall. It was a picture of her grandchildren, taken last summer at the lake. Their faces were bright with joy, their arms around each other. Her heart ached as she looked at them. What kind of world would they inherit? She had always wanted the best for them. A world where they could thrive, where they could feel safe and happy. But was she helping to create that world? Or was she part of the problem? The question lingered, heavy and uncomfortable. He thought about Marcus again, the way he had spoken about his family's sacrifices, their resilience. He had talked about building a better future, about letting go of hate. Could she do that? Eleanor stood and walked to the window. The night was quiet, the stars faint against the dark sky. She placed her hands on the sill, her thoughts swirling. Her eyes adjusted to the light, and for the first time, she felt like she was looking into a computer. After an instant, she reached out, her body quivering. The window. She didn't know how to fix everything. She didn't know if she could ever make up for the things she'd said, the things she'd thought, but maybe she could start small. And she thought about her grandchildren again. They would grow up in a world that was more diverse, more interconnected than the one she had known as a child. They would meet people from different backgrounds, different cultures. What kind of example did she want to set for them? Eleanor pressed her lips together, her reflections staring back at her in the glass. Marcus's words came to her again, softer this time. It's not too late to start fresh. A new year. A chance to be better. She wanted to believe that was true. Eleanor returned to the table and picked up her plate. She wasn't ready to eat yet, but she didn't want to leave it sitting there, a reminder of her unease. She carried it to the sink, rinsing it under the tap. As the water ran, she thought about what she could do next. Maybe she could start by reading more, learning about the history Marcus had spoken of. Maybe she could have more conversations with her neighbors, the ones she had always kept at a polite distance. And The last person she wanted to interrupt was Vivian, whom Luke had scrutinized, deciding to save her life. Ever since the accident, it wouldn't be easy, she knew that. Change never was. But for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt like trying. She turned off the tap and wiped her hands on a dish towel. She glanced back at the table, the empty glass, and the untouched food. The night felt heavy, but somewhere in that heaviness was the faintest glimmer of hope. But the incident at the grocery store became the talk of the town. By the next morning, people were discussing it at every corner, over coffee at the local diner, during errands, and in quiet moments with family. Marcus's calm yet powerful response resonated deeply, sparking conversations about fairness, respect, and what it meant to truly belong. At first, the story spread as just another dramatic encounter, but the weight of Marcus's words lingered. It wasn't just his poise or the way he had handled the situation, it was the truth behind his message that began to sink in. A mother, recounting the story to her teenage daughter, paused mid-sentence. "We have to do better," she said, her voice heavy with realization. A group of young workers at the local hardware store discussed it during their lunch break, exchanging glances and nodding, as one of them said, "He could have yelled, but he didn't. That takes strength." The story wasn't just told, it was felt. Small changes began to ripple through the town. People held doors open for each other with a little more intention. A few strangers struck up conversations where there would have been silence. Jessica reflect upon her happy life. At the park, children from different backgrounds played together, laughing as if the world had never known division. At the heart of this shift was an idea, a chance to come together. Inspired by Marcus's actions, a group of neighbors decided to host a New Year's potluck. The idea was simple: share food, stories, and goodwill. Fires quickly appeared in shop windows, and the buzz spread through word of mouth. When the evening arrived, the community center was filled with the aroma of home-cooked meals. Long tables were covered with dishes from every corner of the world: spicy curries, buttery biscuits, fragrant rice dishes, and homemade pies. Yeah. The room was alive with chatter and laughter. A man who had never spoken to his neighbors found himself laughing with them over a shared joke. A child shyly offered a cookie to a little girl she'd just met, and they spent the rest of the night running around together. "It feels good to be here," someone said, their voice warm with gratitude. This is what community is supposed to feel like. While the town was bustling with connection, Eleanor sat at home. She had seen the flyers for the potluck but hadn't gone. Something about the thought of stepping into that space, surrounded by people who might have been there in the grocery store, felt too overwhelming. Instead, she sat on her couch, staring at her laptop. An article about the history of civil rights was open on the screen. She hesitated before scrolling, unsure if she was ready to learn more. Marcus's words echoed in her mind. "My family paid the price for this country in blood, sweat, and tears." The more she read, the more uncomfortable she became. She didn't like what the articles revealed. Stories of injustice, sacrifice, and resilience filled the page, each one challenging the beliefs she'd held for so long. For the first time, Eleanor felt something shift. It wasn't clarity, not yet, but it was the start of something new, a crack in the wall of her assumptions. At the time, Dr. Lee was... Over the days and weeks that followed, Eleanor began to make small changes. She waved to the new family who had moved into her neighborhood, something she hadn't done before. She smiled at the young cashier the next time she visited the grocery store, managing a soft, "Happy New Year" as the girl handed her change. These weren't grand gestures, but they were significant for her. Each small step felt like a piece of the burden she carried was being lifted. The town, too, continued to evolve. Conversations that had once been avoided now found their way into everyday life. People began to reflect on how they treated one another. For Marcus, the change wasn't something he sought credit for. He believed, as his father had taught him, in planting seeds and trusting the process. Some seeds grew quickly, while others needed time. But he knew one thing for sure: every step forward mattered. Eleanor's journey was far from complete, but as she sat in her living room one evening, rereading an article about the struggles of those who came before, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Uh, Marcus sat at the New Year's dinner table, the hum of his family's laughter and conversation filling the room. The table was laden with his mother's traditional dishes, the smell of collard greens and cornbread warming the air. It was a familiar scene, one he cherished every year, but tonight, his thoughts kept drifting back to the grocery store. He may not remember anything, but there had been times he had woken up in the middle of the night to see Catherine lying on her stomach, on her back, waiting for a new discovery. He could still hear Eleanor's words, sharp, cutting, but what lingered more were his own, spoken with purpose, calm, and conviction. His father's voice echoed in his mind, steady and clear. Plant the seed and let it grow. Marcus glanced at his father, who was busy telling a story that had the younger kids at the table in stitches. The wisdom in those words had carried him through the day. Maybe Eleanor hadn't changed right then and there, but something had shifted. He could see it in her face, in the way her hands trembled as she gripped her cart. And beyond her, he could feel it in the crowd, in the way they clapped, nodded, and reflected. The seed had been planted. Eleanor's journey wasn't over. Marcus knew change didn't happen overnight. It would take time for her to confront the beliefs she had held onto for so long, and time for the ripples of their encounter to grow. But he had done his part. He had stood tall, spoken truth, and let his actions show the power of dignity over anger. As the clock struck midnight and fireworks lit up the sky, Marcus smiled. He didn't know what the new year would bring, but he felt hopeful. One moment, one conversation, one act of courage. Sometimes that's all it takes to spark something bigger. Brett, prom scenes. Muhi iska image prmpt bana k do, but mene tuminyo characters ki operants details di app go usko insura car.